Hi, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event, the fourth in our series, What We Need to Do Next. Over the spring and summer, we've been meeting like this once a month to confront some of the burning issues affecting us in the world right now, from why work sucks to ending carceral feminism. We hope that each discussion will give you the tools you need to join the struggle. You can check out our previous events on our YouTube channel, and our next event on July 7th will be with award-winning fashion journalist and author Tansy Hoskins, where we'll discuss how fashion is political, the industry's environmental impacts, who makes our clothes, and whether ethical fashion is the answer. You could sign up at the link in the chat, which I'll put there in just a minute. Before we get started, I just wanted to let you know that you can pre-order the Anti-Capitalist Book of Fashion and Race to the Bottom from our website, where you can get 20% off the retail price now. All you need to do is visit plutobooks.com and use the discount code NEXT20 at the checkout. Finally, feel free to put your questions for our speakers in the chat below for the Q&A section of the event. Over to you, Moya.
Hi, everybody. I'm so pleased to be here today, where we'll be discussing Race to the Bottom, Reclaiming Anti-Racism with Azfar Shafi and Ilyas Nagdee. So just a quick introduction. My name is Moya McLean. I'm a contributing editor at Novara Media. And today I'll be talking to Azfar Shafi, who is a researcher and organizer with a focus on policing, counter-terrorism and imperialism. He's been published by the Transnational Institute and Novara Media, and organized in movements against racism, state violence, and for the Palestinian liberation struggle. Ilyas Nagdee is an activist and writer focusing on anti-racism, civil liberties, and policing. He has written for The Independent, Guardian, and HuffPost, and has appeared on BBC, ITV, and Sky News. And I'm so pleased to have them both with me today to answer the questions about this brilliant and necessary book. So, first of all, both of you, what was the aim in writing Reclaiming Anti-Racism? What audience need did you identify that you thought had to be answered? Who wants to take this first? Maybe Azfar?
Yeah, sure. So everyone, thanks for making the event happen. So it's a bit of the history of the book. We actually first discussed writing the book before the 2020 uprising. Right? I think it's maybe important to situate it. It was just after, I think just at the onset of the pandemic, and obviously just after the general election. Everyone's in despair, trying to figure out what to do, how to orient ourselves towards this new political reality. I guess the book tried to address why we, me and Ilyas, we had been sort of engaged in anti-racist organizing for quite a while, ourselves, but we were dissatisfied both with how, I guess, the mainstream, or what we call the white left, engaged in racism, but also how the politics that sort of predominated within anti-racist politics was often quite shallow. It felt quite, to be honest, quite often canalized into easy discussions about unconscious bias or privilege politics and so on. So the book aimed to address like why are we where we are now, and how do we get there in a sort of historical sense? How did the politics that are predominant now, where they come from effectively? So in short, we're going to address why. For example, I think this came to light. This became even more relevant, I think, in light of the 2020 uprisings, where I guess we want to address why these upsurges, like BLM, so often end up grappling with the same issues time and time again, like an absence of radical political institutions and organizations, a poverty of theory, I guess a bifurcation between anti-racism on one hand, socialism on the other, and anti-imperialism on the third flank. I guess the persistence of discourse around like excellence or enterprise or individual gain, right? And how do you deal with that in a historical sense?
Ilyas, did you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Azfar covered it comprehensively. It was really interesting. Like he mentioned, we started writing the book before the 2020 uprising. And it was interesting how much both the summer 2020 uprising, followed by massive climate mobilizations, followed by the May 2021 Palestine mobilizations, almost forced us to temper our tone slightly and rethink and make sure that we were taking stock of all the movements that were emerging at the time as well, including all the way up to the Kill the Bill movement. So the timeline for writing the book was almost as fascinating as what we were researching as well, in terms of the movements that were emerging at the time.
Very rich, even if for perhaps slightly unorthodox reasons. But so the book quickly establishes two sides of anti-racism organizing in the mid to late 20th century. You term this anti-racism from above versus anti-racism from below. What do you mean by those two terms? Ilyas, do you want to start?
Yeah, so we use anti-racism from below as a shorthand for Black Power. So Black Power was the form of radical community organizing and a consciousness, not a cohesive movement. It's debatable as to whether anti-racism is the right term, though we use it in shorthand. Black Power might argue that anti-racism was what the white left did as an appendage to their politics. This was Black Power integrated struggles for self-determination and for community and intimately bound up with anti-imperialist sensibility. Black Power was the organized political expression of the most alienated and excluded sections of British society, the new Commonwealth, and as such emerged as a potent challenge to the post-war social contract in which they had the least stake. It was a powerful articulation. Black Power articulated the politics integrating race, class, citizenship, as opposed to the mainstream left at the time, who downplayed the role of the centrality of race and citizenship in the formation of class in Britain. So that is sort of like anti-racism from below. And then, Azfar, did you want to take on from above?
Yeah, sure. So I guess Ilyas said if what we term anti-racism from below is a shorthand for Black Power, which we, I guess, periodized from 1967 to 1981, thereabouts. Then anti-racism from above is what emerged post-81 in the aftermath of the 1981 like urban uprising, right? Starting in Brixton, but also spreading across the country after that. And yeah, from below is Black Power, then from above is effectively a stand-in for state multiculturalism and those kind of politics. And we identify a three-pronged strategy whereby we map out the transition from this sort of radical community form politics to a politics of like conciliation or mediation, right? Where it's less about confrontation with the British state and about anti-racism and imperialism, and more about how can we identify sort of an intermediary class of Black minority people or from those communities who can be placed in certain positions within various apparatus architecture and serve like a mediating effect between communities and I guess state apparatus and so on. So yeah, in short, same multiculturalism, and I think we saw it as a product of a strategy that was designed to contain and undermine politics of Black Power as it had emerged in the late 60s, and yeah, transition over to a form of lobby politics. So I guess to put it simply, if you understand that, yes, we had Black Power, what we had in its place after that was a form of, I guess it redefined what power was, what the nation of power was, what the relationship of Black American communities to power was. So instead of Black Power, after 81, we had maybe civic power through NGOs. We had maybe a sort of Black corporatism through like a emerging sort of petty bourgeoisie, middle class subsection of Black and Asian communities who I guess formed their own business lobby or attempts to sort of form a lobby type approach. Or we had Black sort of cooperation with power, so a more advisory role, intermediary role, rather than I guess again politics of confrontation. So I think maybe we can go in later about this three-pronged strategy. But what we identify as animation from above is this process, is the outcome of this process of breaking the back of Black Power and sort of incorporating into the institutions of British mainstream life, so that they had exerted like a disciplining, mediating force on those communities.
Okay, great. And we're going to dig into all of these concepts throughout our chat. But first, I'd just like to ask for really like an example of what anti-racism from below looked like in practice, because you pull out some really interesting examples of who was involved in this and also who, as you say, fell under the label of Black Power, which in the book uses an asterisk. So what was a good example of anti-racism from below at this time?
I'll go for a bit. So again, I mean, just go back to what Ilyas said. I think it's important to recognize that Black Power was not just an ideology per se. It was a form of organizing, and it was sort of wrapped up in a consciousness. And I think that was made possible by the fact that these were struggles embedded in gaining strength from and organizing communities in a meaningful sense. I think the idea of community politics is sometimes like maybe romanticized among the left nowadays. I think this is a true community politics in the sense that these are the most politically advanced sections within Black and Asian communities that sort of led them, incorporated politics, infused it into the work of everything they did. And to give an example, so how it operated on the ground. Like, I think it's like the form of, okay, how it's played out in the context of like industrial struggle and trade union struggle. So in the post-war period, first like migrants from the New Commonwealth, and then I guess British citizens of African, Caribbean, and Asian descent were excluded at large from the institutions of the mainstream left, from the Labour Party, as well as trade unions. And that in context of industry, despite being, I guess, at the bottom of this sort of social hierarchy, class hierarchy, and so on, who had the most, I guess, most reason to sort of push back against status quo, they did not get support from the institutions that were normally existed to support those causes. So, in the absence of support from trade unions, both at the leadership level and often at the rank and file level, there's often cases where sort of Black and Asian workers went on strike, and sort of white workers basically scattered willingly. They sort of undermined it entirely. Even trade unions didn't go along with it because they're racist. So the form of organising that form of trade unionism that these communities took at the time was, I guess, a blurring of the lines between the industrial sphere and community sphere. Examples include the 1972 Mansfield hosiery strike and the 1974 Imperial typewriter strike. Whereby rather than land sort of like the, I guess what we should understand, the traditional model of a trade union, we have the branch, we have a picket, form picket, and so it's organized within the terms of the factory site. These were industrial struggles that were supported by and nourished by the local communities, which were there on the picket lines, were provided, I guess, the ground force for strikers, even if they weren't employed there, supported them with funding, go around with the bucket private funding to keep people going in the absence of a strike fund from the union, and so on. So I guess the main distinction, which actually let's know more detail is about this form of community organizing that sort of was not yet incorporated within the mainstream institutions of British political life, and therefore was more potent in its political challenge, the challenge that represented to the status quo, and also was novel in the forms of organising it took, and had to sort of think creatively about how do you rally our community that we're situated in, embedded in, live among, to support our causes, and rather than, I guess, do the sort of standard method of appeal to unions, appeal to Labour Party, so on and so forth. But Ilyas kind of give more detail and more examples. Go ahead.
Ilyas, did you want to pick that up, or do you want me to move on to the next question?
You can move on to the next question.
Cool. So in opposition to anti-racism from below, when do we first see anti-racism from above emerging in earnest, and what does it look like in practice? You talked earlier a bit, Azfar, about it being state multiculturalism. Well, what does that look like on the ground?
Yeah, so when we talk about anti-racism from above sort of being what emerges from 1981 and from that period of time. And as I mentioned before, there's a three-pronged strategy that we sort of identify and discuss throughout the book as coming through in different ways. So the first is around Black enterprise. So this was the redefining of a political problem of racism into one of simply economics, and seeking to develop a layer of responsible Black leaders. This was, the core of like Thatcherism. And this was what is mentioned in the Scrambled report, which is sort of like the foundational text of anti-racism from above. And what's really interesting is this idea of responsible Black leaders and the need to create a Black middle class also comes from the US. In October 1981, Timothy Raisin, then MP for Aylesbury, visited the United States. And then in now declassified documents from Thatcher's administration, we can see that he leaves a note talking about how after the civil rights uprisings in the States, the creation of responsible Black leaders facilitated the transition from a civil rights movement to a race relations industry. And 2 days before the publishing of the Scrambled report, Timothy Raisin again calls the Prime Minister to reiterate what he learned in that journey. And they're exactly the same messages that we see coming out of the Johnsonian administration we have now. Secondly, of that three-pronged strategy is representation politics, the politics of Black faces in high places, turning communities of resistance into Black constituencies to be represented often by individuals who exert that moderating effect. This was not just facilitated by the right, it was also facilitated by the Labour left and in their relationship with the new social movements at the time. And much has been spoken about within the public sphere around representation politics in general as well. But it's really key when we situate exactly what happened in that period of time from 1981 and the sheer impact that had on political life for these communities of resistance at that time cannot be understated. And the last prong of the strategy that we talk about is civil society, how we see the decline of movements in line with the growth of non-profits and charities, quite often funded by local, national government or private funders, to undertake nominally anti-racist work, whilst they at the same time steadily erode their politics, and how that strategy creates that dependency on funding, encouraging the depoliticization of anti-racism, as well as the professionalization of organizing, and promoting a scarcity culture, as well as a retreat into ethnic enclaves. Those three things in tandem meant that those groups that at one point organized together on the streets stopped seeing each other as comrades and started seeing each other as competition.
I think that's such a good analysis, and the three prongs are really clear and concise. I want to dive into that a bit more. So an example that you pull out is the Labour Party black sections. Azfar, what were the Labour Party black sections, and what does its existence tell us about the changing character of anti-racism in Britain after 1981?
Yeah, sure. So I guess before talking about the black sections in the Labour Party, it's worth seeing in this sort of transitionary period from this Black Power era to this sort of new post-81 era, like why was that sort of Black and Asian people, white communities, thought it worth engaging with the Labour Party despite their record of failings. And one sec, I'll write it down somewhere. So okay, let me get this off early actually. So I think it's important to understand what the Black radical, Black Power critique of like the Labour Party and trade unions was at the time. So their understanding was that social democracy in Britain, the type that had prevailed in the post-war period, you know, welfare state, Spirit 45 and so on, even at its height with the answer of the NHS and so on, was not just disfigured by racism, but it was structured by racism. It's predicated on racism in a structural sense. So I think that it was different from the maybe standard socialist critique, which posits that these institutions, Labour and trade unions, maybe had failed to live up to their potential. Is actually this is a more damning, with more fatal critique really. That you know they were a pillar of a system that actively produce structural racism by locking out and exploiting the already super exploited migrant population, and then the native-born Black Asian population. And if that was, again, that's why it's so threatening, because it was as a critique from the left, from outside the house rather than from within, right? And it was again mashed in form by sort of radical community action, which often came into conflict with the Labour Party and trade unions. I think the saying at the time, from that time, which often quite, you may have heard it, the saying, I can't remember, what was it? Labour toys both the same block, both play the racist game. The idea, and also I think something Allen said, what Enoch Powell, what he says in the first state, so the famous right-wing ethno-nationalist Enoch Powell, where he says one day the Tory party said the day after, and the Labour Party put into action the day after that. I kind of butchered that quote, but the idea that the Labour Party, whatever critiques they may have had outside of power, when in government, they consistently did and have for the last century implemented kind of above and beyond racist laws, anti-immigration laws, anti-terror laws, pro-policing laws, and so on. So again, has Black Power represented a break from these institutions? It was representing a break from sort of conciliatory approach that maybe migrant their parents' generation had tried to attempt, and it's all critiqued them yet. So, but what happened over the course of the 70s, as Britain and elsewhere in the world sort of spiraled into sort of I guess a capitalist crisis, right? It was in a crisis stage, and the post-war consensus began to fray. Sort of model that consisted of like a Labour Party government, trade unions backing them up, and then the Tory party back and forth, was beginning to unravel. And in response to that, you had these sort of two lines of struggle. You had, I guess, maybe three actually. So one had the new left who emerged, I guess, to the left of the existing left in Britain. Had the new right, which is symbolized by Thatcher and Enoch Powell before that, which ultimately won and gained power in 1979. And you also had Black Power emerge as a third critique of a post-war social consensus that was no longer the key falling into crisis. So that happened over the course of the 70s as, and bring back trade unions. So trade unions had, and the Labour Party, so there was a sort of coming to terms with the fact over the course of the 70s that, as the ground is shifting around them, the old model is no longer existing. There's a need, and especially as Black Power organizations and Black communities became more militant, I guess there was sections within the Labour Party and trade union sphere that recognize that it's no longer acceptable or tenable, really, for their own interests to sort of exclude these communities. They had to be incorporated somehow. And also, I guess, something of rapprochement between communities and unions and the Labour Party, which is always uneven. I'm not saying it's a complete embrace, but well uneven. I think that's symbolized with the 1975 Grand strike, which was, I guess, quite famous nowadays, but represented a point where predominantly Black and Asian women struck against factory, and it was supported by trade unions, especially the mining unions, quite vocal in supporting them. So again, over the course of the 70s, there was a slow convergence, an uneasy convergence between sort of Black and Asian communities and the sort of institution of the Labour world, Labour Party and trade union movement. And so I guess that paved the way for, in 1981, if I'm not mistaken, or 82, the formation of the Labour Party Black sections, which was I guess framed as a way of, I guess, taking the struggle, anti-racist struggle, Black Power struggle into the Labour Party by setting up sections which for Black and Asian people to organise within, often with the express aim of like increasing representation within the party apparatus, and including on having more Black and Asian councillors and MPs. And yes, the Black sections emerged and as a sort of expression of this sort of new turn to the institutions and attempt to sort of again take the struggle within the Labour Party, which up to that point they had rejected quite forcefully. And maybe I'll leave it there. Ilyas, want to pick up anything else and what they did and what it looked like? Go ahead.
So, Ilyas, we've talked about 1981 quite a lot and we've mentioned it. Why was it such a turning point for anti-racist movements? And for those in the audience who might not be aware what happened in 1981, can you run us through a few of the major events that made it seem like it would be the peak of anti-racism from below, and instead it ended up being the harbinger of anti-racism from above?
Yeah, so within the book, we situate 1981 quite specifically, not only because it was the 40th anniversary last year, but the sheer number of things that happened that year. So the primary thing from 1981 that most people remember is the 1981 uprisings. These were the uprisings that took place throughout the country, everywhere from Bristol to Brixton, Birmingham to Toxteth, Moss Side to Peterborough, an uprising against both state racism and racist policing of working class communities across the country. And what we sought to look at is how in the aftermath of those uprisings, the state meticulously and in a myriad of ways hamstrung anti-racist movements in a way in which we've never recovered from. And before the, it's really important to remember that before the sort of flames were set that summer, and before the chants when the chants took to the streets, tragically, the start of the year actually started with the screaming of children. In January of 1981, there was the New Cross fire, wherein 13 children died in a racist arson attack in New Cross. This led to the mobilization of the Black People's Day of Action, where tens of thousands of people went from New Cross all the way to Hyde Park. This was organized by the Race Today Collective and the New Cross Public Action Committee. And they specifically took their march down certain routes and through certain places, going down Fleet Street, for example, where the newspapers were based, in a sign to highlight the newspaper's complicity in the racist depiction of Black youth. Following that show of force in the Black People's Day of Action, police descended upon Brixton en masse, becoming the site of Operation Swamp, labelled after Thatcher's famous "Britain will be swamped by people of different cultures" speech, where stop and searches and racist policing just indiscriminately applied to hundreds and thousands of young working class people, primarily young Black people. And then what we see later on in the year as well, just in the summer, was in Bradford, where the Bradford 12 were arrested after makeshift Molotovs were found in their premises, which they made for protection against the fascist attacks, which was so ongoing and frequent at the time, giving rise to the self-defense is no offense slogan. They were acquitted the following year by a jury of their peers. But that year specifically we look at because of the sheer amount of force demonstrated by youth of all stripes across the country, who took to the streets furthered by racist attacks by police and the fascists alike, and against racist state policies which continue to wreak havoc on them and their communities.
Thank you. That was a really useful rundown of why 1981 was such a pivotal moment. So you talk in the book about the merging of anti-racism from above with that state multiculturalism from 1997 with the advent of New Labour. What does this mean in practice? And how did this shape the way that institutional racism was understood and confronted via this sort of state multiculturalism? Azfar.
Yeah, sure. So I guess how we put it is that anti-racism from above was, the product of a process, three-pronged process that Ilyas described, but it really found its ideological expression in state multiculturalism, which I guess we trace as, again, emerging unevenly through the course of the late 80s and then the 90s, really coming into its own under the New Labour government in 97, before kind of dying in 2007-8 with the crash, financial crash. But really, I guess, again, to rewind a little bit, if you recognize that the potency of Black power was the fact that it was, again, it represented politics that could not be incorporated, or was believed to not, could not be incorporated within the confines of British national politics, and it was permanently outside, permanently confrontation. Then we had after that was anti-racism from above, and then we say multiculturalism was basically creating a space within the, again, national body politic for Black Asian people and speaking about issues related to them, right? It sort of gave them effectively a seat at the table in some sense. I think that's how state multiculturalism operated. It's sort of, if you, again, going back to the three-pronged strategy, Ilyas mentioned, there was this representation term. It is predicated on having, I guess, like figureheads within communities who could be, I guess, serve as intermediaries or interlocutors with like state or local government, people who are self-appointed community leaders, quote unquote, or maybe elected figures, or maybe people who had got good at business and decided they would be the representatives of their communities. So multiculturalism sort of, I guess, use that, operationalize that, and put into action. And I think the model which it took was a form of, sort of patronage politics, allotting a corner within the national politics, talk about Black people and issues, Asian people and issues, but really ultimately not doing anything to tackle the roots of racism in any institutional sense. So I think that's, again, how fundamentally what multiculturalism represented was an incorporation of Black and Asian people to some degree. There's still racism, obviously, it's an institutional racism, obviously, but you could be represented on maybe in TV, you represented in government, maybe be represented within the realm of CEOs and so on, and talk about issues. In some sense, you're kept on the leash. You could not go too far. You'd be reined in. I think that's how multiculturalism operated in, by giving the veneer of like racial harmony, by having, again, blackface in our places and so on, but doing little to combat racism that persisted at a structural level and blighted the lives of Black and Asian people and other racialized communities, obviously.
Just going to read an extract from the book, if that's okay with you both. Okay, great. So on state multiculturalism, to take an example, the first Black History Month celebration, organised in London in October 1987, was developed and supported through the Greater London Council and, following the GLC's dissolution, the London Strategic Policy Unit. Led by former GLC project coordinator Akayaba Adesebo, the affair was marked by a distinctly Afrocentric and cultural bent rather than the socialist currents that had permeated other contemporary anti-racist organisations. Was this a key feature of multiculturalism, state multiculturalism, removing these socialist elements? And what other examples are there of this? Ilyas, did you want to take this? Or Azfar, if you're happy to answer.
I'll drop it quickly. Yes, please, I don't. I think I guess one thing we identify in the book is that I guess we try and avoid the betrayal narrative, the idea that everything's going fine and then some looking middle class Black and brown people came along and ruined everything. I think it's a very simplistic, very voluntarist idea, and I think it's more about what are the conditions that enabled this class that existed as a social fact already, and enabled them to rise as a political actor who were seen as leadership figures within their respective communities. And I think that also points to the broader issue of like contradictions that exist within any community and any movement, right? Even in the era of Black power, there were people who were organizing within avowedly Black power organizations that maybe believed that, getting, I think there's one poet mentioned, getting a blackface in the House of Lords was the path towards Black liberation. There are all these people who believe that, enterprise, still do believe that, enterprise and business are the course towards liberation. And I think what anti-racism from above, what this three-pronged strategy did was to pick them up, empower them, and sort of project them as the authentic representation of politics of Black and Asian communities. And what they did, obviously, was sort of by projecting or lifting up, platforming certain people and certain ideologies, others atrophied in darkness. So I think the idea of, I think, the Black issue, for example, is important, because again, even at the time, more broadly, I think all this different ideologies that prevail, and I think there's again another quote in the book where it's someone who analyzes the time talks about certain forms of, I guess, culture-nationalism, form of, I guess, racial politics that only looks at race in terms of at the level of race, that makes sense, or in terms of identity, are more easily co-opted, more easily bought off, and more easily bought into the apparatus of multiculturalism than more radical critiques that try and embed anti-racism and racism within socialist critique and anti-imperialist critique. So yeah, it was definitely a case of by funding, by selectively identifying, platforming, and funding, importantly, certain types of ideologies and individuals who profess an ideology, you give them great prominence, and that includes, again, and the important thing is the government use the opportunity to seize upon already existing contradictions and empower a certain section at the expense of another, who've always had to swim against the tide since then, the last 4 decades, 4 years.
Thank you for that. I want to talk a bit about trade unions and NGOs, because you bring the analysis of that in a really interesting way in the book. So, Ilyas, what do you see the role of trade unions and NGOs being within modern anti-racism, and what do you think it should be?
It's a big question. So around, I'll start with trade unions and then go into NGOs. So around trade unions, when we discuss trade unions in the book, we situate it and by understanding the role that the trade unions played in Britain from the 20th century onwards, which is the broader question of what a trade union looks like in a non-socialist country, attached to a non-socialist party in an imperial heartland, right? So if you understand that the Labour Party represents the social democratic left wing of capitalism, dependent on racial and colonial exploitation, then the trade unions functioned to preserve that order and that exploitation. That's why in the post-war period, Black power movements at the time found little support from trade unions, both from their leadership and sometimes at the level of rank and file, even refusing to support their strikes and often calling for immigration controls. So even though Black power organizations were often avowedly socialist, even though they organized workers' struggles, they often bypassed the established union structures and drawed power immediately from their own communities. This began to shift in the 70s, once the basis of the trade union Labour Democratic Alliance began to collapse a little. There was the leftward shift within trade unions, and Black power organizations became increasingly militant, such that trade unions slowly came to the realization that they had to change tack and reconcile with anti-racist demands. It was this partial and uneven convergence that paved the way for the decision to take anti-racist organizing into the unions with the Black sections rather than outside of them. But this was an approach not without its critics even at the time, who saw this as betraying the industrial community union model and crossing over into the mainstream British left. So when we talk about the role of unions within anti-racist organizing, it's historical and rooted in that structural role of trade unions. It's not us saying in any way that Black and brown people should not join unions. They absolutely should. And it's also, I think even remember during the Youth for Youth strikes a few years ago, people were talking about the importance of it being okay for racialized people to scab, because the union wasn't fighting, wasn't listening to them. And that's not what we're saying. Scabbing's not okay. Trade unions are absolutely important vehicles for struggle, but we just wanted to make sure we didn't portray a romantic view of trade unions as bastions of socialism. And the question of NGOs is even more interesting. So this is always a fascinating one to go into, given sort of the outplayed role that NGOs have continued to play in social movements today. We especially saw this rear its head after the 2020 BLM protest. So when we talk about NGOs, we situate it from understanding that, after 1981, for example, Labour councils were experimenting in municipal socialism, brought in activists off the street and into a paid activist circuit. Although this was very well intentioned at the time, the demands of these activists became council speak. and didn't reflect either the urgency nor the militancy of street demands. The knock-on effect meant that these figures who were previously organisers now had no movements left to mobilise. It coincided with movements turning to funders, state and private alike, in order to survive, toning down their militancy massively. So the NGOization, including of anti-racism, has been disastrous. We see this, for example, even in the campaigns against the hostile environment, which I think is like a good example of where NGOs increasingly are having to overplay their hand and occupy more space than they traditionally have in anti-immigration campaigns. And what I mean here is that there has become a reshaped focus on winning things like limited legislative or judicial victories. I should say here and like point out clearly that the work done by NGOs who are campaigning against a hostile environment is like very important and should not be unappreciated. But what we're specifically pointing to is the fact that NGOs have come to outplay their role in this sphere as a result of the loss of social movements and the vacating of social movement space by working class collectives and others. And this has meant that even over the last 10 years or longer, the only way people can think about the political horizon of the future is how can we stop things getting worse? And the only way they think about, the only routes towards stopping things getting worse that we can think of is like insider advocacy in Westminster, judicial review, and more common these days, like trying to win over a bunch of unelected peers to try and stop things getting worse. We point to the role of NGOs, especially because like this is a completely unsustainable mechanism for social transformation. And that's the point. We're trapped in a vicious cycle where NGOs are having to outplay their hand. And as a result of the vacating of this space, NGOs who legitimately have limitations of their own, whether those are built into the legal structure and policed through state arms like the Charity Commission, or whether they have fundraising limitations and funders that they're accountable to, so they will never go the distance to what street movements need them to say, or reputational ones where NGOs are, at the moment, like continue to be like absolutely ravaged by the right-wing press. All of this restricts their abilities to make the calls that anti-racist movements must. So when we talk about them, we're talking about the importance of it not being left for them. For too long, they have increasingly they've begun to take the space of playing like almost the spear of the struggle, like the tip of spear of struggle over the last 10 years. And that cannot be their role, because the last 10 years is the perfect example of the political horizon continues to be shrunk. And our political imagination and vision of what we want to build continues to like dissipate if we continue to allow them, or we force them even to play that role. That's not a role for, organizations that have to legally meet certain deadlines or reputationally or like are accountable to funders. The movement cannot be left to them. So we approach it like sympathetically, understanding why they've come to occupy that space, but with like absolutely with clarity as to like the absolute risks and the consequences of them occupying that space. I hope that made sense. I feel like I'm waffled a bit.
It made perfect sense. I think it's the NGO example and trade unions, I think, speaks to what this book is about, which is reclaiming anti-racism and not relying on, institutions to do that work, because they can't, as you say, in the way that the streets need them to. And I'm just going to read one more excerpt from the book before I ask the final question when we get to the Q&A, because I thought it was really interesting, which is, it's about the contemporary period, which is, in periods of political weakness, it is easy to be seduced by the appeal of movementism, a fetish for endless, eclectic, but ultimately isolated campaigns without a strategy for transforming them into a coherent political project. Swept up in the romance of struggle, movementism offers no clear path for meditating individual struggles into a political program, and offers no vision beyond the hope of change occurring at some indeterminate point in the future. So the question I'm going to ask now is related to that, and it's in the book, at the very end, you outline 3 steps to regenerating radical anti-racism. Could you outline just briefly, and I think share it between the both of you, what those 3 steps are, starting with Azfar?
Sure. I'm going to cheat by actually reading from the book itself because it's been a while since I read it. So forgive me. So I'll sort of paraphrase, I'll elaborate. But so what then is the pathway for which to regenerate radical anti-racism? Our prescription is in three steps. First is for an anti-racist analysis that reinserts itself within the struggles against imperialism and capitalism. Then for an anti-racist praxis that reintegrates the social, political, and economic facets of racism to turn it into a broader struggle for popular democracy. And finally, to build this analysis into a socialist framework for class struggle that takes as central the dynamics of race, class, gender, and citizenship in order to develop a truly universalist project, sorry. And I think, again, the reason we outline these sort of three-point strategies of how anti-racism was incorporated and undermined is that these are three facets that still are central to any project today. The question of organization is central to how we rebuild anti-racism today. Protest and like endless struggle in the streets is obviously important. It needs to be there. We will be there, but it's not enough in and of itself. We need an organization that can channel that, build it into a political project and a political program, and build political power in order to be the fist that can fight back against the state, rather than I guess how we have kind of now. We have an upsurge in our direction of like mass protests that quickly sweep away. Then there's a backlash that goes our direction, and then try and pull the pendulum back a bit more. There's not a long-term solution. That's all just we sort of going with the flow. I think we sort of need organizations that are radical, that are democratic, that are not the NGO sort of professionalized model, actually organize communities and people in a meaningful way to build their power, to build self-determination back and sort of exert power in the process. And again, to repopulate the field with ideologies that are suitable for the task at hand, to move away from the ideas of unconscious bias as being the root of problems, move away from being a privileged politics as being the root of all the problems, into a real structural analysis of where we are today, how race fits into the equation, and how we sort of fight back really. And I'll leave it there. So let's fill in the gaps.
Ilyas says, don't worry, the gaps don't need to be filled. You filled them in already. So I'm just going to go into the questions from the chat. So Ilyas, maybe you can take this first one. This is from HH. He says, hi all, just wondering whether your book and research looked at identity / race reductionist politics. I can say now, it definitely did. And its potential dangers and the ways class and race have worked together. So how does the modern reductionist version of identity politics play into the pitfalls that might be associated with contemporary anti-racism? Ilyas.
Bloody Twitter. No, so yeah, we absolutely look at race reductionism within the book, and we talk about and we take this all the way back as well, because this is also like the growth of the race awareness training and unconscious bias and all of these sort of all of these various mechanisms through which racism began to be situated outside of the conversation of the structural and into the imaginary of the individual, and being an individual thing to get right or get wrong, and the way in which anti-racism from above forced the creation of sort of ethnic enclaves fighting for scraps of a meal, as opposed to organizing together. So we look at race reductionism within there, and I thought the end of the question as well, if I'm spoke about the ways like how we talk about race class in the book as well, and we see the sort of the modern day way in which sometimes the race versus class question is like continue to be churned out as a false dichotomy, like race structures class and class formation. It is not an add-on to class. It's the means through which the working class is formed, and the means through which class exploitation is preserved and reproduced. Class in Britain is integrally bound up with the questions of race and citizenship. And class is a relationship to the means of production, not an identity. So in turn, race is a social system marking out the structural relationship of certain social groups to power and to processes of exploitation, and the indexes divisions of labor and social control. So we discuss all of this and more in the book as well. I think particularly around race reductionism and the warnings against it, we outline the ways in which anti-racism from above has created the ethnic enclaves, and the way in which anti-racism from below was the complete opposite of that. And the way in which Black Power movements saw their victory by organising the racialized working class collectively and organising in tandem with all the other groups at the time as well.
The next question really feeds on to what you were just saying as well, and I think you answered it partly, Ilyas, but Azfar, if you want to take this. So HH also asks, they were wondering what role has neoliberalism played in the current formation of anti-racism?
Yes, I think in some ways you can potentially take our analysis as an alternative history of the emergence of neoliberalism in Britain under the Thatcher government. As part of it, I think sort of the, again, going back to the three-pronged strategy, if a central plank of it is Black enterprise or Black brown enterprise, you can see how that maps onto the idea of entrepreneurialism that was central to the Thatcher's sort of vision of a neoliberal Britain. But I think, again, it's sort of in a broader sense, there's maybe a 7-step process, which maybe ties into the last question too, of how we got, how this sort of interacted with neoliberalism. So one, again, if you go back to the era of Black Power, what we had was an integrated analysis of race, class, and citizenship. And what the sort of post-81 period was to decouple these, such that race could exist on its own, aside from class, aside from citizenship questions and questions of imperialism and so on. Then you had an anti-racist politics that was domesticated. So you only focused on what's happening to your skin folk within confines of Britain, and being less interested in or less actively engaged in struggles abroad, back home, maybe in the third world, as it was known then, which was central to the work of Black Power organizations. They were quite explicit that they were, I guess, the British flank of a third world struggle, rather than just another part of the British left. And that came out a lot even in the constitutions. So that happened, domesticated it. So integrate analysis, then you decouple these, then you domesticate analysis, and then you had representation politics, which again is one of our strands of our three-pronged strategy, whereby the question of again, this question of race, class, citizenship was reduced to a question of merely identities and really constituencies. So again, if you represent a people or group or claim to represent them, it helps to have them as sort of tightly defined as possible. So rather than organic, heterogeneous communities in struggle, communities of resistance, you had the Black community, quote unquote, the Asian community, quote unquote, Muslim community, quote unquote, and that quickly became, especially people interested in political office, the Black vote or the Asian vote or the Muslim vote. So in that process of flattening both the political distinctions within communities, then flattening them into flat constituencies, and then flattening class distinctions such that an emerging middle class who maybe had gotten a very infinitesimally, can't say the word, tiny section of the Black and Asian communities who maybe did well under Thatcher, were emerging as a force in Britain, and they could emerge as a political force, but it, I guess, closes the gap between the fact that their experiences were often quite distinct from their working class counterparts in terms of their experiences and so on. It enabled them by framing Black and Asian communities as constituencies, as flat, it enabled them to represent the community because they had very little fealty towards, or very little relationship towards, other than maybe born there or have it looking the same, or so on and so forth. And again, that's how it reorganized anti-racism and so on around an emerging middle class element of Black and Asian communities, and enabled them to be the leading edge of anti-racist organizing, such as, again, people who got something good out of neoliberalism and the Thatcherite turn were able to become the political force representing anti-racism in this new era.
That was extremely comprehensive. So I just have another question, actually. I want to address the elephant in the room, which is social media. Obviously, this is something that has developed in the last 10 or so years, but what role do people perceive social media as playing in contemporary anti-racist movements versus its actual impact? Ilyas.
This was a great question, and it's really interesting. So I've known Azfar for about 8 years now, and whenever we have conversations around movement organizing or struggle or what's going on at the time, it's fascinating to have that conversation with someone who's permanently offline, whereas I'm someone that's awfully online more and more. And it's really great to be rooted in some sort of reality sometimes by having that conversation with him. So I think where we are is, over the past decade, there's been so much written about the ability of social media to democratize movement, You know, you can organize demonstrations in lightning speed. You could generate solidarity across an international sphere, all of those things. But although social media has done wonders around bridging geographical divides, it's also expanded social gulfs massively over the last decade. You know, as a medium of collective organizing, it's more often served to reproduce the very social alienation it purports to heal by concentrating the hostility of wider society. In terms of anti-racist organizing specifically, it moves away the focus of attention towards online battles with bad takes, battles with opportunists, whilst producing an imagined proximity to meaningful struggle. The online sphere thrives on fire and light, Twitter storms, pile-ons, all the rest of it. The complete opposite to the slow burn process of building solidarity. And when we were writing the book, we used the example of like the Black People's Day of Action, right? And we mentioned it before. If that was carried out today, how would that have confronted the tendencies across social media now? Clapbacks are high value currency nowadays. So what would the level of bad faith be generated by those hindering the work of activists on the ground? Would the New Cross Massacre Action Committee be subject to like shoddy trials by tweets in the names of accountability? Could the ideological divisions that existed even within the community at the time in the lead up to the day of action, how would those be navigated, negotiated, or used online? Or more likely than not, they would just spill out into absolute bitter acrimony. That's not even touching on the way in which social media has created a culture of mutual surveillance, whereby solidarity is coerced rather than cultivated. You know, the most ridiculous height of this is, of course, the surveillance of one another's silence. You know, something occurs. Has someone with over 10,000 followers condemned the latest outrage, or is their silence complicity? And when it comes to the issue of historic posts being unearthed, you know, have they apologized? Is there a correct apology? You know, is it a notes apology? That's not right, but it should be long. It should outline a process. What process? You know, like all of that. And I think one of the lines that we use in the book is like, you know, today's spy cops need not don a uniform or infiltrate communities. All they need to do is make a Twitter account. Through this dynamic, solidarity has become like a transactional commodity rather than a transformative relationship. At its most grim, social media is an arbiter of worth, being used to determine whose struggles deserve support and whose don't, by virtue of their ethnic or social group. So I think for all of its promise and even, you know, partial success, we do need to realize that like it's well past time to do away with solidarity tweets and do more solidarity.
You know, that's a great line. Yeah, go on, Azfar.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think Ilyas maybe sound like I'm sort of wise elder. It's definitely not the case. Like, I'm not on social media, and that's for your benefit, ultimately, people out there. I'm sure if I was on there, I'd be beefing with everybody. This book would not happen because I'd be beefing with Ilyas. I'm sure of his takes and stuff. So, you know, we recognize critiques. We have a critique of social media. We recognize the culture that engenders, but I'm not by any means saying that I would be insulated from that. I'll be the worst possible example if I was on there. So thank God I'm there. That's what I'm saying.
That's called self-preservation, and I think I need to take more of a note of doing that. Something I wanted to ask as well is, in the book you talk about how urban transformation has obviously changed community as we know it, and in doing so has undermined sort of anti-racism from below and the organization of that. Are we seeing any corrections to that? And also, how do we see pushback against the breaking up of communities that are key for anti-racism from below? Azfar, do you want to take that?
Sorry. Yeah, sure. So I think, again, if you recognize that how Black Power worked as a form of community organizing, because at the time we had quite segregated communities, pockets of Black people, Asian people, we know we are there. So you know where they are across London, Birmingham, Manchester, in the urban centres, Bristol, and so on. And those self-contained, they're often unintegrated, and therefore was able to organize as a community because you were there physically. And that was the first step, obviously. Being there, being able to organize them, having institutions in which to organize them, having political education forums in which to sort of educate them and so on. But ultimately, they just made possible because they were together. There have always been attempts to sort of break up these communities through maybe under the guise of maybe slum clearance in the 70s onwards, and also through the idea that I think after the non-killer riots of 1959, if not mistaken, there's also a big drive to, I guess, break up what existed in migrant communities, because it was seen by being concentrated in a space that were identified as a risk by the government. Anyway, that still persists today. I think we live in a time where gentrification is on the rise in a major way. And so in a very concrete sense, the communities as we understand them are being broken up, fragmented, sold off to the highest bidder. So I live in London, you know, all the sort of hotspots of, or were, I guess, historical places where Black and Asian people live together, from Brixton to Tower Hamlets to Notting Hill and so on. Okay, there's a transformation undergoing. So I think, I guess, the struggle for community starts with the struggle for community to exist, right? We're having this process of identification, dispersion, people being shipped out to the outer realms of Essex, no offense. So what we need is sort of, I think, housing struggles, anti-gentrification struggles are in many ways central to this process of rebuilding community as organizing form by preserving community as an actual fact on the ground, right? Yeah, I'll leave it there, but I think these sort of struggles are vital to rebuild the community.
And I just want to talk quickly about Kill the Bill, because you pull it out as an example in the book of something that I think you talked about earlier as well that quite surprised you, and you had to change the sort of temper, maybe the pessimism that the book had initially started with. Ilyas, how do you see Kill the Bill in terms of anti-racist organizing, and what elements of it are in parallel with sort of anti-racism organism from below in the past?
Yeah, I mean, in the book we both talk about the way in which post-summer 2020 abolitionist collectives like punching above their weight, in ways that we've not seen, and how the rise of Kill the Bill especially like gave hope to campaigns against state violence, and to campaigns against state violence and policing. I'm pretty sure in the book we specifically look quite a bit at Bristol's Kill the Bill campaign as well, and we draw the parallels of like what happened in Bristol in 1980 with what's going on in Bristol now, and the way in which, you know, like Avon and Somerset police haven't changed their tack in any way with how they deal with protesters and those who shine a light on state violence in the area. I think Kill the Bill and the emerging Cop Watch campaigns that have come out of there provide like great hope in terms of what we can do moving forward. And I think the way in which Cop Watch collectives particularly have not only done this through a lens of like, what's the sort of correct phrase, about being sort of hyper-localized in the sense of they're doing this just for the, hyper-localized in the sense of recognizing the greater picture here and recognizing the need to be joined up. I think that's quite often the mistake that other collectives and organizations working in specific areas have fallen into, where they see their case as an exceptional example or something that has emerged just in their area. So I think where we are in terms of with abolitionist collectives, Kill the Bill and the emerging Cop Watch collectives is they provide great hope and an infrastructure that we should all be involved with. But, you know, we're still, I guess, in the beginning stages of that. There's still a while to see where those movements end up in the future. But there's absolutely no doubt that in terms of within recent years, they've provided like great inspiration and hope in how we build coalitions on our own terms, not on the state's terms, which is again like one of the pitfalls when you operate within organizations like NGOs, etc., where you build coalitions based on like reputational risk or funder risk and all of those things. By bypassing all of that through organizing through abolitionist collectives, like we can take great inspiration in that, I think. I'm not sure if you had anything to add, Azfar, on that one particularly.
And on that note as well, how do you see something like the cost of living crisis, because it is obviously so rooted in, it's going to disproportionately affect the workers who often are mostly members of these marginalized groups. Is that not a key sort of battleground for anti-racist organizing to take its root, especially from this left-wing perspective? So I just wondered how you hope that might be responded to and what opportunities that might offer. Maybe Azfar, if you take this first.
Question. I've got to think about it more, to be honest, but I think obviously definitely it is a visceral concern to people, and I think it's important to respond to it. I guess what I would suggest is, okay, I haven't sort of seen like exactly how all organizations are responding to someone like sort of lecture on what we should be doing, because I'm not sure what they are doing, all of them. But I think there is an opportunity to obviously meet people where they're at and politicize them through the process. I think obviously people in the course of struggle develop their consciousness, develop their politics, and I think it's often a lot easier to start at the point where people are being screwed over than an abstract idea of capitalism out there. I think when pressing on the next in that way, there's obviously a crucial opportunity to intervene. I guess what I would say is, based on maybe the past history, again, not saying I've seen exactly what's happened, there is a tendency towards, again, defer the sort of form organising to maybe the Labour Party or sections of thereof, or maybe trade unions, which obviously trade unions are a key stakeholder. Their work should be supported, obviously, where it happens. But this is the opportunity to again defy those sort of standard template or format of organising. If people are being suffocated within their communities, I guess it's time to reorganise or resuscitate those types of maybe mutual aid networks that existed during the pandemic, where we fell into disarray. But again, if you use the opportunity to rebuild those forms of community organising and institutions of community organising, I think those will be the basis for an actual resistance, one, survival, two, and response and pushback, rather than again outsourcing and hoping that the big national organisations will defend us. Alongside that can happen, but it's opportunity to again rebuild and sort of meet your neighbours, see where they're struggling, support them when necessary, keep them afloat fundamentally, but also build them up as political actors that come to understand they can affect change rather than hoping someone else can do it for them. So fundamentally, I think this opportunity really to rebuild community organising in the greatest traditions of Black Power and beyond.
Yeah, once again, it's key, isn't it? It's not the reliance on those institutions. There's one more question, Ilyas, maybe you want to take this, and then after that we'll wrap this up. So this is from Hamza, and they say, are you able to expand how much anti-racist organising was very much rooted in anti-imperialism? And is there any of that work happening right now in the UK? I think this also is a question that lends itself to something we didn't get time to discuss as much, but something you do in the book, which is internationalism. You talk about that a lot.
Yeah, write a whole chapter on it. I'm just thinking about the time constraints what we're going to focus on. Yeah, I mean, Black Power movements were unavowedly, explicitly, unapologetically internationalist and anti-imperialist. What we see from anti-racism from above and the retreat into cultural nationalism and ethnic enclaves is the absolute gutting of anti-imperialism from those politics. And what we see by the growth of the civic society model, the NGOs, the paid circuit of activists, etc., is the fact that anti-imperialism becomes censored speak. If you talk about it, you're immediately shunned or cast aside from political life. And what we see, and we talk about it particularly in the way within which anti-imperialism, the third world anti-imperialism declined at the same time as international human rights grew on the rise, and the way in which many people have now talk about international human rights, for example, in the context something like in the context of a situation like Palestine, but the discussion around anti-imperialism is completely removed from conversations around Palestine these days, and instead the cause of Palestinian liberation is left at the altar of human rights discourse, which suffers from all the same faults of, as we spoke about in regards to NGOization on an international scale. In terms of, is there any such work happening right now in the UK? On a mass scale, I can barely think of any, like mass scale anti-imperialist organising taking place, bar where we see that taking place in the form of solidarity campaigns specifically. But I see Azfar's unmuted, so maybe I'll hand it over to him to take.
I just want to shout out some organizations I think are doing important work, like Palestine Action. I think is at the forefront of Palestine solidarity work in the country and should be supported. Also, I think it's often like organizations that maybe exist, I guess, below the radar of the mainstream left. I think diasporic organizations within Britain of countries facing imperialism often do a lot of radical work that isn't listed. For example, during the Bolivia coup in 2019, the sort of Bolivia diaspora groups are active that dealt doing solidarity work, which actually be supported, and so on and so forth. So again, Palestine Action, one, but also again, these communities who are directly linked back in a very material sense to struggles happening at home. I think supporting their work, building them up, integrating them within our analysis of world politics and so on, it is a way to, again, rebuild anti-imperialism from those at the receiving end of it.
Thank you so much, both of you. So we're going to wrap up there. And I just want to thank Azfar and Ilyas for their time and being so generous with it and their thoughts in the form of this book, which is out in 2 weeks, is it not? 2 weeks, and is available via Pluto Press. It's fantastic. It charts a course of anti-racism through sort of the early 20th century right to now, and it travels through everything from these Black Power movements, the Afghanistan war, policing, surveillance. This is, I would say, the Bible to sort of the anti-racist movements in Britain. So if you want to know about that history and where we stand now and how we got here, I really would recommend getting this. So yeah, thank you again for everybody watching, and have a wonderful evening.